Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we've got a pretty controversial figure to unpack. Sani Abacha.
Yeah, a pivotal figure in Nigerian history for sure. But you can't really get a handle on his impact without looking at him from multiple angles.
And that's the fun part. We've got some historical analyses of his regime, but we're going to start with something a little different.
Oh, let's hear it.
We're going to kick things off with a short story from this collection called The Ghost of Sani Abacha by Chuman Nwokolo.
Interesting. Fiction can be such a powerful way to look at power dynamics, even if it's not a straight-up historical account.
Exactly. This particular story, it's about this waiter, and he has this very tense encounter with the Minister of Oil and Steel's wife in an elevator.
Yeah.
It's actually pretty funny the way Nwokolo writes it.
Yeah.
But what really struck me was how he uses this small, almost absurd situation to hint at the bigger picture of corruption going on under Abacha.
It's so clever. You've got the waiter tempted by a bribe, but then he makes this completely different impulsive decision. It's all driven by these unspoken power dynamics. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. It's like even at the bottom of the social ladder, this waiter understands the rules of the game under Abacha's rule. It's a pretty stark contrast to the historical accounts that paint a broader picture.
Right. Speaking of those accounts, sources like Nigeria during the Abacha years and Nigeria Soldiers of Fortune give us a more comprehensive look at his rise to power. What I find striking is that he was involved in practically every single military coup in Nigeria during his time in the military.
Wow. He was involved in coups in '66, then he helped bring Buhari to power in '83, and then he helped oust Buhari just 2 years later. So he was constantly in a position to climb the ranks.
Exactly. It really makes you wonder about his motivations. Was he just power hungry? Or was there something more ideological driving him? We need to understand why he was so successful at these power grabs to understand his later actions as head of state.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So when he seized power in 1993, his actions as a leader were kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, you see all these improvements to the economy. Foreign exchange reserves went up, external debt went down, inflation was controlled, there were even investments in infrastructure.
That's what makes Abacha so fascinating. How do you have a leader who is infamous for corruption overseeing real economic progress?
It's a total paradox.
Right. We have to be careful not to simplify his legacy. Yeah, there were economic gains, but at what cost? The accusations of embezzlement, the infamous Abacha loot that paints a very different picture. We're talking about potentially billions of dollars siphoned off through these elaborate schemes and a global network of collaborators.
Billions. It's mind-boggling. Imagine what that money could have done if it had been used for Nigeria's development. But corruption wasn't the only problem.
No, his human rights record was atrocious. The execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa, an Ogoni activist who protested against environmental damage caused by oil companies, that drew international condemnation and even got Nigeria suspended from the Commonwealth. Abacha's regime silenced dissent and used force to maintain control.
It's a stark reminder that economic progress doesn't tell the whole story. So, what really jumps out at you from all these accounts? Are we starting to see a clearer picture of Abacha?
Yeah, I think we're starting to understand the complexities. The contradictions. Abacha's rule was full of light and shadow. He was a brilliant strategist, capable of driving economic growth, but also deeply corrupt and ruthless in maintaining power.
It's a legacy that continues to affect Nigeria today. It's amazing how we see this economic progress happening at the same time as all this corruption and human rights abuses. It's a lot to process. But I'm curious about what happens next. What were the long-term effects of Abacha's rule? His legacy? Where do we even begin to untangle all that?
It's a real mess, that's for sure. One way to start thinking about it is to look at the impact of some of his policies. Like his decision to stop those privatization programs that Babangida had started. We're still seeing the ripple effects of that today.
Right. Nigeria's Soldiers of Fortune talked about that. Some people saw it as a way to protect Nigeria's interests.
Yeah.
But others thought it actually held back economic growth and stifled the private sector.
Yeah.
It seems like everything he did had these unintended consequences.
Exactly. And that's what makes analyzing his legacy so difficult. Take the Abacha loot. Billions of dollars allegedly stashed away in foreign bank accounts. It's hard to even imagine that much money.
Yeah.
And the efforts to recover those funds, it's been going on for decades. There have been international investigations, legal battles. It's a whole thing.
I read that Switzerland returned over $1 billion of that money, which is incredible.
Yeah.
But it also makes you wonder how much is still out there somewhere hidden away. What does this whole struggle to get the loot back say about Abacha's impact on Nigeria?
It shows just how deeply rooted corruption is. And it highlights the fight for accountability, but it also shows the commitment of the people who are working to fix the mistakes of the past. The fact that there's still international pressure to recover these assets, it's a sign that things are changing, even if it's slow.
It definitely gives me hope.
Mm.
But speaking of things shrouded in mystery, let's talk about Abacha's death. It was so sudden, totally unexpected, and there were so many rumors.
Oh, yeah. His death in 98, he was only 54. It was a huge shock for Nigeria. The fact that there was never an autopsy, it fueled all kinds of speculation. People were whispering about poisoning and foul play. Even U.S. intelligence thought he might have been poisoned. But there was never any real proof.
It just adds another layer to this already complicated story.
Yeah.
But beyond the mystery itself, his death really shook things up politically. Didn't it basically pave the way for Nigeria to transition to civilian rule?
Absolutely. General Abdulsalami Abubakar stepped in, and within a year there was a transition to a civilian government. Olusegun Obasanjo was elected president in 1999.
Obasanjo, the same guy that Abacha had thrown in prison for treason. What a crazy turn of events. That can't be just a coincidence. Do you think Nigeria was always headed towards civilian rule? Or was Abacha's death the thing that finally made it possible?
That's a question that people are still debating. Some people think that the pressure for democratic reform was already building. Both within Nigeria and from the international community, Abacha's death might have just sped things up a bit.
But others think that Abacha had such tight control over the military, and his grip on power was so strong. They say that if he had lived, Nigeria would have stayed under his authoritarian rule. We'll never know for sure, but it's definitely something to think about.
It shows how unpredictable history can be. Even the most powerful people can't stop the tide from turning. But one thing's for sure, Abacha's death was a major turning point for Nigeria. It opened up the possibility of a new democratic beginning.
It's a key moment in Nigeria's story, and it leads us right into the next chapter. Obasanjo's return and the challenges he faced trying to rebuild a country that had been so deeply affected by Abacha's rule. But before we get into that, I want to take a minute to thank all of you, our listeners. This deep dive wouldn't be possible without you.
We really appreciate your support, your subscriptions, your likes, your comments, everything you do to help us keep these conversations going.
You're the reason we can keep exploring these important and often overlooked stories from Africa. So if you're enjoying this deep dive, tell your friends, leave us a comment. Let's keep the conversation going.
And now, let's get back to our exploration of Nigeria's past and see how Obasanjo dealt with the complicated legacy of Sani Abacha.
Welcome back to the show. It's wild to think that after everything we've talked about, Olusegun Obasanjo, the guy that Abacha imprisoned, he ends up being the one to lead Nigeria into its fourth republic.
It's almost poetic, isn't it? Obasanjo comes back to power, but this time it's through a democratic election. It really marked a break from Nigeria's history of military coups and authoritarian rule. It was such a hopeful moment, you know? A testament to just how resilient the Nigerian people are.
From prisoner to president, that's quite a journey. And it seems like that time he spent under Abacha really shaped his approach to leadership. Nigeria's Soldiers of Fortune points out that as soon as he took office, Obasanjo made fighting corruption his top priority. He even created these anti-corruption agencies to go after anyone who had profited under Abacha.
It makes sense. That focus on accountability, it was a direct response to how bad corruption had gotten under Abacha. Obasanjo saw the damage it had done to Nigeria's development, how it eroded people's trust in the government. He wanted to change things, set a new standard.
I was reading about how he even went after some really high-profile figures. Some of them have been close allies of his. It must have taken a lot of courage to challenge the status quo like that, and to risk alienating powerful people. But it sent a clear message. No one was above the law.
Yeah, and that commitment to the rule of law, that was crucial for rebuilding trust in the government and for laying the groundwork for a stronger democracy. His efforts definitely ran into some roadblocks, but they did lead to some significant progress in recovering some of that Abacha loot and holding corrupt officials accountable.
It shows that even when things are really tough, change is still possible. But when we look back, how should we think about Abacha's impact on Nigeria's journey toward democracy? His regime was brutal, there's no denying that. But in a way, his death opened the door for a new era.
It's a really tricky question. How do we reconcile the terrible things that happened under Abacha's rule with the fact that his death ultimately led to democratic progress? It makes you think about cause and effect in a whole new way.
History's messy. It's full of contradictions and things you don't expect. We can't just forget the suffering that happened under Abacha, but we also can't ignore the fact that his death created an opportunity for positive change.
Absolutely. It's a complicated legacy that we need to understand in all its complexity. Abacha's rule is definitely a warning about what happens when power goes unchecked. But it also shows us that even in the darkest times, change is possible.
It reminds us that we have to learn from the past. We have to hold our leaders accountable, and we can't ever stop fighting for a more just world. And speaking of responsibility, I want to take a second to thank you, our listeners, for coming along on this deep dive. Your support means the world to us.
We really appreciate you tuning in, and we hope you'll continue to explore these amazing stories from Africa with us.
Remember that waiter in Mulakalo's story? In the end, he makes this crazy choice. It really highlights the tough moral decisions that people faced under Abacha's oppressive system. It makes you think about how our choices are shaped by the systems of power and corruption that we live in.
It's a powerful image, something to keep in mind as we go about our lives. We encourage you to read Chumon Wakalo's The Ghost of Sani Abacha for yourself. It's a great way to delve deeper into these themes. Keep asking those tough questions, keep learning, and keep the conversation going.
Thanks for listening. Until next time, keep diving deep.